Hi, it's Wit, and in this video I'll be giving an overview of the negative side of the debate for the January-February Lincoln-Douglas topic. This topic concerns whether or not states should eliminate their nuclear arsenals, and if you haven't watched Rafi's affirmative overview yet, you should watch that before this, as it will rely on some basic knowledge in there, as well as a conception of what AFs people might run, to give some context in regards to what these neg positions respond to. In the next few days, more topic analyses will come out, specifically going in depth on areas like AF, util debates, neg util debates, fill debates, T and topicality, in depth thoughts on deterrence, how nuclear proliferation works, is it good or bad, etc. This is meant to give you an early start to your research and give an overview of some neg positions that we've already assigned. To start off, I'll talk about some common disheads that are likely on this topic. The ones I'll be covering are largely generic and apply to AFs that either eliminate all nuclear weapons or ones that eliminate ones in major countries like the United States and China that are often major players in terms of nuclear weapons. First is the conventional war disad. This is similar to a trade-off argument, where it asks the question of what fills in when nuclear deterrence is gone. When nuclear weapons no longer exist within the world, what do countries turn to resolve conflicts? Many authors argue that nuclear arsenals act as an effective defense against conflict. Um, Nuclear arsenals prevent escalation in terms of countries invading others because no country without nuclear weapons, or even with them, would normally have any rational explanation for why they would go invade a nuclear country. In addition, things like the US nuclear umbrella, as well as the nuclear umbrellas of other countries, mean that if nuclear weapons are used and other weapons of mass destruction are used against other countries that we're allied with, will also protect those countries and supposedly do a second strike in those cases. Without nuclear weapons, authors argue that this deterrence completely erodes, and conventional wars will become much more frequent and even cause things like arms races, where we move to more and more high-tech weapons. For example, things that utilize AI can cause massive destruction, even if they're not nuclear weapons, which are much more likely to escalate because there isn't that one cloud of nuclear weapons hanging over things, which can cause mass death or even extinction through other mechanisms that aren't nuclear war. The next disad, which I'm grouping a few into this, which I'll just refer to as CEBC weapons, cyber, bio, and chemical weapons, deal with trade-offs to specific other weapons of mass destruction. This is basically the same thing as a conventional war disad, though it will have impact scenarios that are specifically tailored to the likelihood of transitions to other weapons. This argues that in the absence of nukes, countries will turn to things like cyber weapons, biowarfare, chemical weapons, in order to fill their place. These can be more dangerous than nuclear weapons for a few reasons. First is that there are less checks on them. Right now, we have a large non-proliferation regime. It is hard to covertly develop nuclear weapons, um, and it's easy to attribute who launched a nuclear weapon and respond. However, there isn't the same ability to check that with something like cyber weapons or attribution, because many times it's extremely difficult to even figure out who is launching a cyber attack. It took months, for example, to effectively pinpoint that North Korea hacked Sony a few years back. It can also be asymmetric. There's no longer the equal checks of mutually assured destruction, but some countries may develop significantly superior chemical weapons or biological weapons that there isn't an effective response to, or one that can be effectively deployed. They're easier to fall into the hands of terrorist groups. For example, cyber weapons are available to theoretically anyone with access to a server or computer. Chemical and bioweapons can be as small as a tiny disease that is released into the public and rapidly spreads. And these can also be existential threats. For example, if someone were to spread a disastrous disease to the public, it would be an extremely dangerous scenario, and could lead to, a complete loss of all human life. Additionally, some other common dissads we'll likely see are the nuclear energy dissad. This says that proliferation makes nuclear energy much cheaper. This is for a few reasons. First is that without development of nuclear weapons, there is less demand for things like uranium, uh, which increases costs due to basic supply and scale problems. It means that there will be much higher controls to prevent them. In a world without nuclear weapons, countries will be very paranoid about other countries developing nuclear weapons since they don't have defenses, which means that nuclear energy will be subject to likely strict regulation that is under watchful eye by tons of other countries and could even lead to miscalculation. For example, if a country saw someone enriching uranium and thought that it was being enriched for nuclear weapons instead of nuclear energy, which could lead to escalation in cases where it was less relevant. Um, the impact scenarios to this can be miscalculation, an argument about how nuclear energy resolves climate change. Many authors argue it's essential to filling in things like intermittency gaps that you are likely familiar with because of the November December topic. Um, Next, I'll talk about the econ dissent. This can be taken in a few different routes. I think the two most likely link arguments that will be seen on the econ dissent deal with first the defense industrial base. This is often referred to as the military industrial complex, defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, the companies that develop weapon systems in the United States and abroad. Nuclear production, nuclear weapons production, is increasingly done by defense contractors in the defense industrial base. The development of nuclear warheads, ships, planes that can hold nuclear weapons and potentially drop them are all a major facet of defense contracting orders. Without them, you can make an argument that the defense industrial base would be significantly hindered in its ability to develop other weapons and have economic viability, which means that our abilities to fight in things like conventional war would also be harmed by the lack of nuclear weapons, which may put us vulnerable to other countries or put other countries vulnerable because they also have possibly competing defense industrial bases. The next link you could go with is the nuclear disposal disad. There are astronomical costs to disposing of nuclear waste, including things like nuclear warheads. It requires not only uh, mere technology for rapid construction of nuclear arsenals, but protection because nuclear waste no longer does not just disappear, but it rather degrades over centuries of time, which means that we have to both create facilities that can effectively house them, personnel to safeguard them from being taken by terrorist groups, rogue actors, as well as just leakage. All of these create astronomical costs, and there's tons of literature saying that it would create extensive costs that you could argue would have any number of impacts from decreased competitiveness to budget trade offs, etc. In terms of counterplans, I think we'll see a few different ones. For example, country picks. Nearly all countries have strategic reasons for nuclear weapons. These include defending against adversaries, deterring against regional conflict, protecting allies, etc. These strategic reasons are often reasons that people likely make for picks. For example, you could make a US pick, arguing that the US nuclear umbrella is essential to preserving our allies' stability, protecting the US's international order, etc. We will likely see things like the Israel pick, which says, for example, that without nuclear weapons, Israel would be uh, much more vulnerable to invasion and conflict within the Middle East, which would escalate to a larger war that draws in many competing actors within the Middle East. However, you should be aware of tricky scenarios. Doing a pick out of any one country, whether it's the US, Russia, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, India, etc., means that country would likely become the de facto hegemon of the world. If one country is the only one with nuclear weapons, they have tremendous ability to essentially force any country to act according to their whims. It could increase conflict. For example, if only India had nuclear weapons, it would significantly alter the balance of the India Pakistan conflict um, and would create many different conflicting battles, which means that you should be very cognizant of this on the neg and app and think about how you handle these concerns. There will also likely be advantage counterplans to solve things like miscalculation, accidental nuclear war, increased proliferation. This can be things like hotlines, which develops infrastructure for increased communication in the case of a nuclear attack, which would allow for de escalation. This is things like the often talked about Cold War phone line, which gave the president rapid access to talk to Russia in the case of uncertainty over the status of nuclear arsenals. There are also debates. There are also likely going to be counterplans based around NFU, especially because it was a college topic last year. NFU stands for No First Use, and it's an explicit policy that says a country will not be the first one to use nuclear weapons and will only use it in the case that another country launches them. This obviously has problems where it's hard for a country to us to hold a certain country to that. That's where things like operational NFU come into play. Operational NFU imposes physical barriers to first strike. For example, deconstructing nuclear weapons. So, in the case where they wanted to launch a nuclear weapon, they would have to reconstruct their nuclear arsenal from base building blocks they have ready, which adds substantial time delays and means that we'd be able to take action to intervene in the case where a country were preparing to launch a nuclear attack. We'll also likely see weapons picks. One interesting one that'll probably cause very, very interesting debates is space nuclear weapons. Um, Nukes, for example, to shoot down asteroids that are coming towards the Earth, which could potentially cause an extinction scenario. Nukes that can be targeted against things like space junk, which may cause other issues. You'll likely see a lot of these because the current college policy topic deals with things regarding space. There are other ones that could potentially exist, things like ICBMs in certain countries, short range nuclear weapons, etc. You should definitely be exploring the literature and looking into different types of weapons and why certain ones may not link to certain uh, arguments that the AF makes about proliferation. Finally, I'll talk about the case page. I think a common argument will be circumvention, which is that banning nuclear weapons means that countries will create covert development and do it without having an internationally declared uh, nuclear weapons program. This can be argued to be more dangerous because we no longer have the ability to track what countries have them, what they're doing, or any international non-proliferation regime to impose regulations regarding it. Major powers may also no longer have nuclear weapons, while other countries may covertly develop them, which means that in that case, countries would have the ability to become a hegemon or pose significant threats to countries all over the globe because mutually assured destruction would no longer exist. This obviously comes in debates over the scope of affirmative fiat and whether they can fiat out of that, but I think there are definitely valid neg arguments because things like circumvention are commonly discussed within the neg literature, and it's a frequent debate. There will also likely be, you also want to be making defense arguments against proliferation. Future TAs will cover this a lot more in depth, but important arguments to make are things like the fact that there haven't been accidents in the past. Even in cases where we've thought that other countries have launched nuclear weapons, we've had efficient and effective de-escalation. Domino theory is clearly not happening as fast as some people may have predicted 30 or 40 years ago. Uh, there New countries with nuclear weapons are not rapidly popping up because there are substantial development barriers and things like allyships have prevented that in the past. Massive retaliation also deters small players from launching nukes in the first place. For example, if North Korea were to launch a nuke, we could likely stop it, as well as bombard them with hundreds of nuclear weapons in response, which means that other countries having nukes may not be as dangerous as we think, especially small rogue ones that nuclear proliferation scenarios often discuss. There are also substantial barriers people discuss to things like loose nuclear weapons or terrorist attacks. For example, just the fact that it requires massive infrastructure, technical know how, and there are substantial safeguards on the status quo that prevent them from acquiring them. One common question I've already gotten is how do you respond to specific countries? This may seem difficult, but you benefit from the fact that there are very few countries that have nuclear weapons in the status quo, and there are qualified people who write in favor of proliferation in countries like North Korea and Iran. For example, they are often framed in terms of regional stability. Um, for example, that countries like Iran having nuclear weapons is good for deterring conventional war, even if overall they may be a dangerous player within the nuclear weapons game. There are often things like regime collapse. For example, in North Korea, the presence of nuclear weapons has been very important to holding the Kim regime in power. Well, some people might say that's an argument against them. There are also plenty of arguments for why regime collapse makes everything worse, creates a power vacuum where things like existing nuclear weapons may go into more dangerous hands or just be unable to be tracked and create massive existential scenarios that could be more dangerous than the mere presence of nuclear weapons. It is also often framed in deterring U.S. war. This is something we may not often think about because we often think about nuclear weapons in terms of risks from other countries, but given constant threats from the United States in terms of attacks towards North Korea and invasion, many authors within the national security literature argue that North Korea and Iran having nuclear weapons prevents a dangerous North Korea US war or North Korea or US Iran war, which may pose devastating effects on both countries. Next, I'll transition to K arguments. There is a pretty wide range, and I think we'll likely see a lot of rehashes of arguments from the military topic, given that this is also one where the AF can frame themselves against U.S. hegemony and war movements. A few arguments I think we're likely to see are first the black bomb argument. This is an interesting and possibly strategic K, both because it takes it and calls for nuclearization, both metaphorically and in actuality, yet also disagrees with specific framings of nuclear weapons the AF makes. The black bomb argument, how it's been run in the past, argues that our approach to nuclear weapons is often framed through an anti black international order. Countries that have power and deserve to be treated with respect and diplomacy on the international stage are those that have nuclear weapons. Global stability through things like treaties and weapons have been denied in the past to the African continent. Africa does not have any nuclear weapons. They only did for a brief period in South Africa during an apartheid regime. Their authors argue that there is a need for African nuclear weapons development, which would effectively put it onto the international stage and pose a massive challenge to U.S. claims of the liberal international order, international protection, and framing global stability through an international order that is overwhelmingly Western and white. There are often also links to anti-blackness and pessimism arguments. These argue that anti-war framings are often structured around anti-blackness, both in the way that they're rhetorically constructed and the ways that things are framed in terms of U.S. empire. For example, the slave is neither subject to nor a part of U.S. empire, which throws it into a position of non-positionality. If you don't exactly understand what that means, that's totally fine and goes into sort of the depths of anti-blackness literature that you may not be completely familiar with yet, and that's totally fine. You should be looking at things like how Afro-pessimism was debated on the Jan-Feb 2019 topic of military aid, because a lot of the links will be very identical to the ones that will likely be run on the Jan-Feb topic this year. Baudrillard and other postmodern theories will also probably be written, given they often frame things in terms of discussions of deterrence and war. Baudrillard specifically, though I don't have a perfect grasp on his arguments, writes about deterrence in the way that war is structured to become a non-event within society. Things like proliferation impacts that attempt to escape nuclear annihilation believe in a causality between U.S. empire, war, and peace that is no longer within the realm of truth, which is rather constructed on the level of hyperreality, rather than actual physical weapons arrangements. Nuclear war's non-existence is not because of nuclear weapons exist, rather is because war now becomes tied to more insidious forms of symbolic violence, and other impacts that no longer require nuclear war or the threat of totally annihilating weapons in order to functionally uh, destroy existence. This reading is fairly dense, though there are plenty of examples in terms of things like YouTube rounds. Teams like Michigan KM, for example, have read tons of arguments in the past about tying war weapons to our present day and frames Baudrillard in that context. Um, Authors like Shapiro, Baudrillard, as well as others, are people who you probably want to look into in this context. Additionally, the final K argument I'll talk about is settler colonialism because it's very tied to discussions of nuclear weapons, nuclear waste. This argument would likely argue that nuclear discussions erase the history of nuclear contamination and genocide on native lands. There's a history of nuclear waste, weapons testing, etc., on sacred land um, that has been taken from natives as well as lands that they are already living on. I think this can often be framed in terms of the question of what's happened in the past when we dispose of decommissioned nuclear weapons. They have been very often placed onto tribal lands, which shows that it's impossible to sort of separate the discussion of nuclear weapons and eliminating U.S. empire without simultaneously recognizing that that has intrinsic ties to increased settler colonial violence, and shows that simply framing things in terms of war ignores the ways that the U.S. already engages in war against native communities through nuclear weapons. And you should critique the framing of things like future nuclear war, given that you can say that that is already happening to native communities. This concludes my PowerPoint and topic analysis. I want to emphasize that this is a starting point and not an end point, both in terms of topic analyses. Many more will be coming soon that go much more in depth into these, but also that these are just a small set of arguments that can be made on this topic, and that you should take this as a grounds to start your research. But research is a continual process, especially on our longest topic of the year. And being cognizant of that will help you find new, innovative arguments that you may not have found yet in the first few days of the topic. Feel free to ask me or any of the other coaches questions, and I'm excited to start researching this topic in depth with you all. See ya.